Okay, we're talking about transcultural issues in TESOL at the invitation of TESOLacademic.org. My name is Martin Cortazzi. I'm from the Centre of Applied Linguistics at the University of Warwick, and part of the practical research that I'll mention in the second half of what I want to say is work done with Li Shengjin at the Montfort University. What I want to do is first talk about a few ideas about culture, then talk about some aspects of global English, then think about culture and TESOL in terms of textbooks and materials, and finally and mainly talk about the processes of teaching and learning of English as a second language from a kind of transcultural perspective. Transcultural, of course, means cross cultures, and this might be slightly different from cross-cultural and intercultural. The basic idea of all of these terms, as far as we're concerned now, though, is to compare cultures, look at cultures in interaction, see how TESOL students need to think about and be aware of culture, and for teachers as well as students be aware of how this actually affects moment-to-moment pedagogy. First, let's just say a word about culture itself. There are about 5 dangers in many discussions about culture. One of these is elite ideas about culture. So that's culture perhaps with a capital C, referring to literature, art, history, citizenship, and so on. Usually that's dismissed in discussions of culture in favour of thinking about everyday culture among most people. However, from the educational point of view, we shouldn't discount that. It's really a question of making it accessible, and for instance, instead of talking about English literature, talk about literatures in English, or Englishes, and making them accessible. A second point is that culture is often reified, meaning people talk about it as if it's a thing or an object. That means it's probably static, it means it's probably background, and is thought to be some sort of contextual influence. The problem with that idea is that culture is dynamic, it's changing, it's in flux, it's intermeshed, certainly these days, with other cultures. So we need to think about culture as a verb, as a process, rather than as a thing. Thirdly, we've got the idea of labelling and categorising people and cultures. Difficult and dangerous if we start using national labels. And we need to think of culture not as this or that, or this culture compared to that, but relationships between cultural practices, how culture, whatever culture we're talking about, relates to an immediate context and situation. So for instance, cultural identity, most people these days would think about culture in terms of multiple identities rather than a single sort of national label. 2 other things. One is reduction. It's very easy to reduce a culture or a whole series of cultural practices as 1 or 2 kind of key ideas. The tendency now is to draw attention to that and try and avoid it, but we do need to talk about it. And the final thing is homogeneity, the idea that as soon as you talk about a culture or a community, suddenly everybody in that group is the same. My definition of culture would include diversity. We might even say a particular culture goes as far as how it can tolerate diversity within it. When it doesn't, we've reached kind of the periphery or some other culture or something else. So those are 5 aspects about talking about culture. Generally, the current tendency when talking about cultural issues in TESOL is to think locally and contextualise into smaller and smaller groups. But on the other hand, we do need to generalise about culture, otherwise how can we talk about it, learn about it, think about it? It's clear if you look at textbooks about education, anthropology, TESOL handbooks and so on, that language and culture are intermeshed. You really can't discuss one without coming to the other before long. So language and culture, inseparable. TESOL and culture, inseparable. They kind of construct each other. Think of the example of a courtroom. When the court is in session, only certain people can speak, probably in a certain language, meaning style, in a certain way, to certain people who have to reply in certain ways. But imagine before the court is in session, people there can say what they want. The cleaner can talk, the visitors can talk, until somebody gives a signal, the court is now in session. So the culture's constructed the language, but the language also constructs what goes on as it goes on. And the next piece of language will immediately be added to that context. So this whole idea is, as you can hear, pretty complicated. Okay, now thinking about some transcultural issues in TESOL. I'm going to talk about this very briefly at 3 levels. First one is the nature of global English as a language. At a kind of macro level, worldwide, it's clear that English is used in many businesses, professionals use it. It's used in international relations, international development, tourism, leisure, sport. A long list. At the same time, worldwide, that means some commonality, otherwise nobody would call it English, or English is, but it also includes diversity, style, genre, pronunciation, accents, grammatical variations, and so on. And clearly, in particular countries and across countries, English is used as a working language for many, many people. Think of the migration of workers and their families using English from one country to another. In many contexts, the world is surprisingly multilingual and multicultural. For instance, it's been estimated recently that 50% or more of the population in between 11 and 14 of the states in the USA would be Latino, Spanish speakers coming from Latin America. That's a majority in a fair number of states in the USA who are clearly bilingual, bi or multicultural, and that kind of affects people's perception of what it means to be American. But it's not just America. In Britain, for instance, at least 10% of the British population was not born in Britain. In France or Germany, it's about 12, maybe 13 or 14%. In the United Arab Emirates, I read it's over 90% of the population was not born there. So we have to think it's normal to move around. It's normal for people to use English when it's not the native language of anybody in any particular working group, including students and teachers. We can extend this idea a bit by thinking about cultures of communication, the idea of ethnography of communication. Remember Hymes's idea, S-P-E-A-K-I-N-G, people adjust their speech according to the context and the audience and so on. People study this when they study TESOL, usually as sociolinguistics, kind of out there somewhere. But of course it's in the classroom as well, isn't it? Depending on the diversity of students and teachers, but in many classrooms there is a kind of multilingual, multicultural composition within the classroom itself, which means that practices of speaking vary a lot. And we have to begin to think, well, this is normal. In New York, a survey about 5 years ago found that children in New York schools, between them, speak more than 200 languages. In Melbourne, in Australia, about the same number. But in London, more than 300, at least 320 now. I mean, that's a lot of languages. And the cultures that go with them, this is huge, huge diversity. We can't pretend it's a homogeneous population. That's in the schools. So this is clearly the way things are going in terms of how education and TESOL as an aspect of education, whether it's private or public schooling and institutions and universities, needs to think about this huge diversity. And so the learning of TESOL is a preparation for that kind of transcultural, business, professional, migrating world of the world of work. We can also think about this, secondly, in terms of cultures and TESOL. Years ago, people used to talk about the target culture and the home culture. So you kind of had C1, analogous to L1, would be our culture. C2 would be the target culture. But of course now, given the picture that I briefly painted, this just doesn't work. How many people would learn English in a kind of global community in order to relate to one culture? Well, they might, but people from other cultures will necessarily come into that culture, so that even without travel, other people will travel to us. So we need to think about C2, C3, C4, British, American, Australian. And then, of course, was the idea that somebody from Scandinavia travelling to Japan is probably going to use English, because how many Japanese speak Scandinavian languages, or vice versa. So the kind of the third culture, or culture X, Y, Z, this kind of multiplicity is what we need to think about in terms of targets. So the teaching of TESOL means a kind of preparation for intercultural communication practices and using English in a transcultural way. People coming to us coming to people. Think of English as used in the media worldwide, for sports, for leisure, for tourism, and many, many other things. However, if we look at some TESOL textbooks, if we look at the texts, if we look at the visuals, the multimedia contexts of teaching and learning English that may accompany textbooks, if we look at the tasks and activities, what sort of cultural demands are made on the students? What sort of cultural demands of knowledge, skill, awareness, understanding, empathy and things like that is being made by teachers in using materials? So it's not just whether the materials are multicultural, have a transcultural perspective, it's whether the teacher does and has the ability to exploit them in that kind of raising awareness way. The idea of transcultural content, I mean, it's quite interesting. Here's an example to look at. This is an advertisement, and it's from a bank, which has made about 5 years worth of adverts like this. What is tea? Tea that you drink. The advert suggests that as an institution operating globally, this particular bank understands local context. It understands that tea in Turkey, in China, in India, in Britain and elsewhere is different. And of course it is, with or without milk. Black, red, green. Is it drunk with sugar? Is it drunk through sugar? What does having tea and enjoying a tea break mean? Of course, it's quite different. So the point is, you could have one kind of practice interpreted very differently in different countries. The second point about this example is this is entering the world of commerce as a way of advertising banks. So culture, like ecological issues, becomes a way of advertising what people do. So we need intercultural, cross-cultural materials inherent in textbooks and so on. Li Shenjin and I have been trying to do this in textbooks in China, the New Standard College English textbooks published by Macmillan and Beijing Foreign Language Teaching and Research Press. And in the teachers' books, we tried to help teachers relate international cultures exemplified in the texts and video materials with China, so that students are able to reflect on what it means to be Chinese, to speak Chinese, to be in China, compared with learning English with a global awareness. And of course, the underlying point is you become who you are, or you know who you are, through considering yourself in relation to others. So the standard idea about teaching and learning culture is it's not just learning cultures out there, targets, C2, C3, C4 and so on, but coming to be aware of one's own cultures through that process. Okay, now the third idea, the processes of teaching and learning English in educational context and what this means from a transcultural perspective. The idea that Li Shenjin and myself have been trying to develop over a number of years is the idea of cultures of learning. What we want to say is, learning is cultural, not just individual and psychological. So the cultures that people bring into the classroom in terms of their behaviour, values, attitudes, beliefs, what they think learning is, who they think teachers are, what they think course books are for, what an essay means, and so on. All of those things, among other aspects, are cultural. So to appreciate this, we need to study different cultural practices and be aware of them in TESOL. Okay, I'm going to give 3 examples for the rest of this talk. Example 1 is students not asking questions in class. The question is why? Well, when we look at this in different classrooms in 2 or 3 continents, in English classrooms, we see that there are layers about why students don't ask questions. One is, maybe they weren't asked. Maybe, in a particular context, you have to be nominated to ask a question. And the teacher asking the class as a whole doesn't elicit much of a response. But it could be the opposite, couldn't it? But in some cultures, exemplified by some Native American cultures, studied some time ago, shows the opposite, that nominating students, asking them by name, doesn't work because people don't like to be singled out. What you have to do is ask a group, they confer, and somebody answers for the group. Different cultural practices use questions differently. But we also find, for example, in our research in China, students don't want to ask questions because they're shy, like those in Turkey. They feel embarrassed, perhaps, if they're afraid of making mistakes, like those in Lebanon, or Iran, or Malaysia, or Brunei. But there might be other layers particular to some cultures. For instance, in China, students might not want to answer teachers' questions in case they're wrong. They might not want to ask questions in case the teacher doesn't know the answer. In Britain and perhaps the USA and other places, hardly a problem. The teacher would say, well, I don't know, but I'll find out. Or, I don't know, but we'll find out together. There's, I don't know, but. But in many cultures, Africa, Latin America, major parts of Asia, a teacher can't say that because of the cultural value of knowledge. And the teacher, as a source of knowledge, can't, or feels he or she can't, confess ignorance in the classroom. And of course, the student who asks a question to which the teacher cannot know the answer and is put in a position of saying, I don't know, makes the teacher lose face. In that case, the student loses face by being the person who made, in public, the teacher lose face. The example should show us something, that there are layers of cultural aspects about asking and answering questions in class. Okay, here's another idea. Let's look at these photos. Now, we took these in China and Lebanon as examples. It's the idea of group work, study practices, and using books. Okay, in the first set here, these are primary and secondary classrooms in China. Just have a look at the book. The teacher holds a book, the student holds a book. Students hold a book in a certain way, a fixed way. Everybody's holding the books in the same way. Here, now the students are using group work, but look at the books. And here, it's about the books. And here, it's through the books, discussing the book. So there's something deeply traditional and cultural and text-centered about who uses the book and how, which will mediate the practices and introduction of group work. Okay, second idea. The idea of memory and recitation. This is in a middle school in China. This is the teacher's office. By the way, look at how much marking the teacher has to do here. And the teacher here has asked the students to recite a text. So you can't hear it, but you can see it. The student is reciting a memorized text as a regular practice. It shows the value of memorization, but it's linked with confidence, fluency, accuracy, and some other aspects. But this would be anathema in some other context. Students would say, oh, I don't want to do this, I'm not a parrot. Who wants to recite? Don't ask me to do this. I want to learn in other ways. Okay, now move to Lebanon. Here, the students are doing some group work, they're discussing a text, they have to make a model, literally a picture, of the text. They work in groups quite happily. There's no textbook, there's no book mediating their discussion. They're clearly talking to each other. This is the model they've made. You might know the text. It's Francis Bacon talking about studies with different people reading in different ways. And then here the student presents the group's model, which is this drawing about the boat, to the rest of the class. This group work works because of group ideas and social ideas about learning in Lebanon. But it wouldn't work, not easily, in some other cultural context. Okay, 3 more examples. One here, the idea of self-study. We're in China, it's early morning, before lectures in the university. What's going on in the campus? Students are reading aloud, move from picture to picture. They're holding their body upright, or sitting straight mostly, holding a text. If you were to pass by, you would hear English being recited. It might be a vocabulary list, English, Chinese, Chinese, English. Or it might be a whole text. The students might be walking, they might be crouching, they might be in a nice place. It's a traditional practice. When we showed these photographs to teachers in China, they said, yeah, that's what we used to do. Okay, move to Lebanon. This is quite different. Here, early morning, same time, in the university campus, yes, again, the students are preparing to study. But how? Is anybody standing up reciting? No way. People are sitting comfortably, slouching, they're smoking, they're eating, they're on the mobile phone, but particularly, they're talking about the texts. It's a social activity. Observe this group, somebody comes and goes, the groups shift from moment to moment as people drop in on a group and move to another group. Whereas here in China, they were almost a metre apart, no matter what. Look at this photo here, can you see? Person, 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 person. One morning I counted 108 students around this patch of grass. Every single one was separate, and most of them were reciting. Some were reciting in their head. Could you do that in Lebanon? No! How do we know? Because we showed the Chinese photographs in Lebanon and the Lebanese photographs in China. The Chinese students looking at the Lebanese pictures, here's some more, said, what are they doing? I said, they're studying. They said, but you can't study like that. I said, well, could you do what they're doing? They're chatting, they're socialising, but they're talking about their studies. No way, it doesn't look serious. So the Lebanese, I showed the Chinese photographs and said, well, what about this? And they said, well, we couldn't do that here. Now, people would laugh at us if we were reciting. What I'm indicating is the cultural practices of learning around the world are different. And this is what we've been researching. Okay, a final example. We've been doing recent research about metaphors. And that's asking students and teachers to give us metaphors for a teacher. A teacher is the sun. Why? Oh, providing heat, warmth, light is necessary for students' growth and so on. A teacher is a gardener. How? Well, they nurture students. They provide a good environment for students. And then somewhat poetically, some students in Iran told us they water the students' growth with their sweat and with their tears, pouring out their efforts on our behalf. So the idea of the teacher as a gardener sacrifices. Okay, another example is the teacher is a candle. What does that mean? Now, if you ask British students what that means, I will nearly guarantee they will say, well, a candle has light. Yes, okay, the teacher provides light, the light of knowledge, the light of understanding, and so on. But in our data from Oman, Lebanon, Malaysia, Iran, at least, the candle metaphor comes up frequently among students, and it means sacrifice. So the candle gives light, and it burns itself down, it melts away in order to give its light to others. It's all about sacrifice. So this image about teacher sacrifice, I think, would be understood once you explain it elsewhere. But it's not a natural metaphor or a normal way of thinking about teachers by many students who might be learning English from a candle-thinking teacher. Or maybe candle-thinking students are being taught by a teacher who doesn't think like a candle, if you see what I mean. What I'm getting at is we need to know students' ideas about learning and teaching in order to be able to teach them. It's a point of professional development for those engaged in TESOL as teachers to try to understand what learning means, because teaching is all about learning, right? It's the learning of English and using it. Just one other example, it's one we've been analysing in great detail recently. This is from China, but there are parallels in the Middle East and other countries we've looked at. It's the idea of a journey. Learning is a journey. You go to a destination, you work hard to get there, you go from place to place, there's a landscape that you cross, and so on. So learning is a journey. As a metaphor, this is common in many cultures, and students would be familiar with it because it's a way of talking. Think of goals, think of targets, think of the direction, the movement, the stages, the steps, the climbing of different levels and ladders and so on. However, whereas in our data in Iran and Lebanon and Oman and Malaysia, we find the journey is characterized as being endless, continuous, you need hard work, yeah, it's like climbing a mountain perhaps. The metaphor more or less stops there. In Britain, it's characterized as a roller coaster. Learning has its ups and downs. It's exciting, it's like a fairground ride, it's an adventure. Learning is that kind of journey. But here in China, this is more. And my point about this is that we can learn about learning and get new insights for TESOL and other people engaged in teaching and learning through looking at this. In this case here, look. Learning is a journey from hell to heaven. It demands constant effort. You go onwards, you go upwards, you go forward. Students have a strong belief in success. They make a constant effort. Many students talk about this. They have to be tireless, persistent, they have to be determined, they have to persevere, and so on. They search for treasure and enrichment. Literal wealth, they reach literal success, but also the journey involves hunting for jewels and treasures and diamonds. Hell, yeah, it can be purgatory, it can be torture, it can be horror. But most students pass through that on the way to heaven. Learning, including the learning of English, is reaching the place of our dreams, our destiny. It's a beautiful place. It's a paradise. It's a place of brightness, wisdom, truth and life. You can see this is very strong imagery. But what do you feel on the way? There's a very strong affective element and aesthetic element. It's bittersweet. It involves pain and joy. It involves happiness and sadness. And the teacher is a key guide. Remember the teacher is a candle? Lighting the way. The teacher is a lighthouse so that you go to safety on your journey. So what I'm saying is the picture of learning we get from this involves aesthetic ideas. Learning is beautiful. Moral ideas. It's right. It's truth. It's the right way. And it involves the strong idea of effort and success. We can learn about learning. I think those three things that I've talked about with TESOL, with culture, with materials, and especially this idea of the culture of learning and teaching, has very strong messages and insights for students and teachers of English wherever you are. What are your metaphors? Thank you.